The fierce winds of Zoro 7 howled through the cavernous ice formations, carrying crystalline particles that sparkled like diamond dust against the dim purple sky. Jonas Hale pulled his thermal collar tighter around his neck. Though he knew the gesture was more psychological than practical, his standard-issue Galactic Alliance uniform was designed to maintain optimal body temperature in environments ranging from the vacuum of space to the sulfuric acid lakes of Denova Prime. Yet something about the bone-deep chill of Zoro 7 seemed to penetrate even the most advanced thermal technology. "Trainee Hale, you're falling behind," barked Verax through the comm system. The general's voice, already naturally intimidating with its multi-layered tonal qualities, typical of the Crassian species, sounded particularly harsh when filtered through the static of their weakening communication system. "Sorry, sir. Taking readings of the ice density." Jonas replied quickly, tucking away the small metal tool he'd been using to tap against the translucent blue wall beside him. Unlike his peers who relied exclusively on their scanner units, Jonas had brought along several handcrafted tools from Earth. His fellow trainees had laughed when they saw the primitive implements packed alongside his standard gear, but Jonas had grown up in the Alps Preservation Territory, where his family maintained one of the last operating ski lodges on Earth as a heritage site. Traditional survival skills had been passed down through generations of Hales, despite the generally held belief that such knowledge was obsolete in the age of quantum fabricators and atmospheric stabilizers. Zoro 7 had been officially designated Level X Uninhabitable by the Galactic Council 17 years ago. Its surface temperatures fluctuated between -100 and -150 degrees Celsius. Its atmosphere was primarily crystallized methane with traces of nitrogen, and its constant seismic activity caused unpredictable ice quakes that could open chasms kilometers deep in seconds. The moon's only notable feature was its spectacular network of ice caves, some tall enough to house entire colonial habitation domes filled with otherworldly beauty and deadly danger in equal measure. "All units converge at coordinate point Zurich 7, commanded General Verax. "The training exercise begins now." Jonas quickened his pace, his boots finding purchase on the slippery surface through a combination of the magnetized grip soles and his own experienced footing. Ahead, the 6 other members of his training unit were already gathering in a rough semicircle facing the general. Rex, a towering Venerian with iridescent scales that shifted in color with his mood, currently a cool blue that matched the surrounding ice, nodded curtly as Jonas joined the formation. The gesture wasn't exactly friendly, but it wasn't openly hostile either, which was an improvement in their typically strained interactions. General Verax's exoskeleton clicked as he adjusted his stance, the sound echoing through the vast ice chamber. "Your assessment is simple. Survive for 72 hours in the Zurich cave system while monitoring seismic activity and maintaining a communication beacon. Teams of 2, except for Hale, you'll operate alone." Jonas felt a momentary surge of anxiety quickly suppressed. Operating solo wasn't unusual for human officers. The Alliance often utilized humanity's long history of adaptability in extreme circumstances as a tactical advantage. Sir, Sarek, an Aurelian with silver-feathered head crests that quivered in the cold, despite his thermal suit, raised a slender hand. "Our geological surveys indicate increased subsurface activity in this sector. Is this intentional?" "Life doesn't arrange itself into convenient safety parameters, Trainee Sarek," Verax replied. "Your equipment has been calibrated to alert you if conditions exceed training parameters. Separation in 15 minutes. Prepare your stations." As the group dispersed to unpack their gear, Jonas took a moment to survey the enormous ice cavern. The Zurich system was named after the Earth city, supposedly because the first human explorer to map it had been reminded of Swiss ice caves. The comparison hardly did justice to the scale the main chamber rose, at least 1,000 meters above them, its walls rippling with bands of deep blue aquamarine and occasionally startling black, where a vein of alien mineral cut through the ice. Massive columns of ice formed natural pillars throughout the space, some as wide as buildings, supporting the weight of the moon's crust above them. Jonas selected a location near one of these columns where a natural alcove provided protection on 3 sides. The position wasn't as spacious as the areas his colleagues were claiming, but it had the advantage of being partially sheltered from the endless wind that somehow found its way even this deep beneath the surface. Planning to dig yourself a hole like a primitive? Rex called over his scales, shifting to a somewhat amused purple at the edges. Our thermal habitats deploy in 60 seconds and maintain perfect equilibrium. Just evaluating all options, Jonas replied neutrally, though he was already noting how the ice patterns in his chosen spot suggested a more stable crystalline structure than the wider, more impressive areas the others had selected. Years of studying avalanche patterns had taught him that beauty and safety rarely coincided in ice formations. The first 12 hours passed without incident. Jonas deployed his standard Alliance shelter, a geodesic dome of transparent nanomaterial that hardened upon exposure to air and maintained a constant internal temperature of 22 degrees Celsius. The shelter was entirely self-sufficient, drawing energy from the ambient temperature differential between its interior and the external environment. In theory, the colder the surroundings, the more efficiently it should operate. In practice, however, Jonas noticed the first warning sign around hour 13, a slight fluctuation in the dome's luminosity, barely perceptible but concerning nonetheless. He was in the middle of logging the anomaly when the first tremor hit. It wasn't a major quake, just a shudder that ran through the ice, causing a faint tinkling sound as microscopic crystals shifted and settled. But it was enough to trigger the Alliance emergency system, bathing the entire cavern in pulsing amber light. And it was enough to cause the first critical equipment failure. "Thermal regulator compromised," announced Sarek's panicked voice over the comm. "Temperature dropping 3 degrees per minute. Backup systems unresponsive." Jonas was already moving, pulling on his exterior gear and grabbing his toolkit. He emerged from his dome to see Sarek and his partner Naylan struggling with their habitat, which had developed an alarming ripple along one side where the nanomaterial appeared to be destabilizing. "The molecular bonding is failing," Nalin explained as Jonas approached. "The quake must have affected the quantum alignment." Jonas examined the rippling section. "Can you reroute power from your communication array to reinforce the thermal shell?" "Already tried," Sarek said, his silver crest fully extended in distress. "The system won't accept manual override. It's as if the programming itself is degrading." More troubling reports began filtering in over the next hour. Rex and his partner Toval were experiencing similar issues with their habitat's structural integrity. 2 other teams reported power fluctuations severe enough to trigger emergency protocols. Only Jonas's habitat seemed relatively stable, though his thermal regulation had dropped by 7%. "All units report status." General Varax's voice cut through the chatter. The general himself was stationed in an observation post 20 kilometers away, monitoring their life signs and habitat functions remotely. After listening to the increasingly concerning reports, Varax made a decision. Training parameter adjustment authorized. Units may collaborate on habitat stabilization. Maintain separation of personal survival systems. It was a significant concession that essentially allowed them to help each other without fully abandoning the assessment's individual evaluation component. Jonas immediately offered his assistance to Sarek and Nalin, whose situation seemed most critical. "The crystalline structure of this ice has unusual properties," Jonas observed as he helped them attempt to stabilize their habitat. "It seems to be generating some kind of electromagnetic interference pattern." "Impossible," Rex said, joining them with his own tools. "Ice is just frozen water. It doesn't generate fields." "On Earth, maybe," Jonas replied, running his handheld scanner over the area. "But Zoro 7's oceans contained high concentrations of magnetized heavy metals before they froze. The crystallization process could have aligned the molecular structures." Rex's scales flickered with skepticism, but he didn't argue further as they worked to patch the failing habitat. By hour 18, it was clear that even their combined efforts couldn't fully restore the systems. The temperature inside the habitats continued to drop, and the structural integrity warnings became more frequent. Jonas made his decision during a private moment of contemplation, standing at the entrance to his relatively stable but gradually failing habitat. He looked across the cavern at his struggling colleagues, then down at the primitive tools in his pack that had earned him so much ridicule. Without announcing his intentions, he began to gather his equipment. "Where are you going, Hale?" called Toval, noticing Jonas dismantling parts of his habitat's non-essential systems. "To build a proper shelter," Jonas replied, his breath forming clouds in the increasingly cold air of his failing dome, "the old-fashioned way." The others watched with a mixture of confusion and dismissive amusement as Jonas abandoned his high-tech habitat and moved to the alcove he'd initially selected. Using the metal cutting tool from his pack, he began to carefully carve blocks from the ice wall, testing each section before cutting to ensure he wasn't compromising structural integrity. "He's going to freeze to death," Rex muttered to Sarek loud enough for Jonas to hear. "Humans and their romantic notions about primitive survival." Jonas ignored the commentary, focusing instead on the task at hand. The first few hours were the hardest working, with increasingly numb fingers despite his thermal gloves carefully stacking the ice blocks to form a rudimentary windbreak that would serve as the foundation for his shelter. He used the synthetic cord from his emergency pack to reinforce the structure, melting the ice slightly with his portable heat source, and then allowing it to refreeze around the cording, creating a solid bond. By hour 24, the other habitats were in serious trouble. Temperature regulation had failed in 3 of them, forcing their occupants to don full thermal gear inside what were supposed to be comfortable living spaces. Structural integrity warnings had become constant, and 2 teams had experienced partial collapses that required emergency patching with increasingly unreliable materials. Meanwhile, Jonas's ice shelter was taking shape. He had constructed a domed structure roughly 2 meters high at its center, with walls 30 centimeters thick. The entrance was a narrow crawl space that minimized heat loss, and inside, he had created a small platform raised off the ice floor where he could place his sleeping mat to minimize contact cooling. Most importantly, he had incorporated a critical component from Earth's Arctic indigenous peoples, a small ventilation hole at the top of the dome that allowed his breath to escape without causing interior condensation that would eventually rain back down as moisture. The second tremor hit at hour 27. It was stronger than the first, causing several dramatic cracks to appear in the cavern ceiling and sending a cascade of ice crystals raining down upon them. 2 of the Alliance habitats collapsed entirely, their occupants barely escaping before the nanomaterial structures imploded under the stress of structural failure. "All trainees report status," came General Varax's concerned voice. The situation was dire. 4 trainees were now without shelter, their survival depending entirely on their thermal suits, which were never designed for prolonged exposure to Zoro 7's extreme conditions. Their estimated operational time was less than 24 hours before power depletion. "Hale, what is your status?" Varax asked, likely noticing from Jonas's life signs that he was no longer in his assigned habitat. "Operational, sir," Jonas replied. "I've constructed an alternative shelter using local materials." There was a pause. "Explain." Jonas described his ice shelter, careful to emphasize the scientific principles behind its construction rather than framing it as a rejection of Alliance technology. "The electromagnetic properties of the ice are interfering with our habitat's quantum fields, but a manually constructed shelter bypasses that vulnerability." Another long pause. "Proceed with your strategy, trainee Hale. All other units without functional habitats converge on Hale's position for assessment of viability." It was a remarkable directive, essentially acknowledging that Jonas's primitive approach might be their best option. Within an hour, Rex Toval and two other trainees had arrived at Jonas's shelter, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. "This won't work," Rex stated flatly. His scales a dubious gray as he examined the ice dome. "It's just a pile of frozen water." "That's what igloos have always been," Jonas replied, continuing to refine the interior by adding a second layer of ice blocks in critical areas. "And they kept humans alive in Arctic conditions for thousands of years before we had thermal regulators." "Your Arctic wasn't negative 120 degrees Celsius," Rex countered. "No, but the principle is the same," Jonas explained. "Ice is an excellent insulator when properly structured. The dome shape maximizes structural integrity while minimizing surface area for heat exchange. The narrow entrance creates an air trap that prevents wind from stealing our body heat." As if to underline the urgency of their situation, a warning chimed from Rex's suit. "Thermal power at 40%, announced the artificial voice. "Estimated time to critical depletion, 10 hours, 17 minutes. "You can share my shelter," Jonas offered. "It won't be comfortable, but we can combine our body heat to increase efficiency." Rex's scales shifted through several colors rapidly, a sign of internal conflict, before settling on a resigned blue-green. "I accept your offer, human." By hour 36, Jonas's shelter had been expanded to accommodate 5 people. The interior temperature, while far from comfortable, had stabilized at -5 degrees Celsius, cold enough to be miserable but warm enough to survive with proper gear. Most importantly, this temperature was being maintained without drawing on their rapidly depleting suit power, allowing them to conserve energy for the remaining 36 hours of the exercise. Sarek and Nalin had managed to partially restore their habitat's functionality and chose to remain there while the last team was attempting to combine parts from 2 failed habitats to create one operational unit. Everyone was communicating regularly, sharing status updates and technical suggestions. "How did you know this would work?" Toval asked Jonas as they huddled in the ice shelter, their breath creating a small cloud in the center of the space. "None of our training covered ice construction techniques. My family runs a historical preservation site on Earth," Jonas explained carefully. Adjusting the portable heating unit he'd salvaged from his habitat, the device freed from the burden of heating an entire dome was now being used for targeted warming of their extremities on a rotation basis. "We maintain what used to be called a ski resort in the Alps. I grew up learning how people survived winter conditions before modern technology." "Seems like wasted knowledge," Rex commented, though his tone lacked its earlier derision. "Why learn obsolete survival methods when we have technology?" "Because technology fails," Jonas replied simply. "Especially in environments it wasn't specifically designed for. The Galactic Council labeled Zoro 7 uninhabitable partly because our standard equipment malfunctions here. But uninhabitable just means we haven't figured out the right adaptation yet." Their conversation was interrupted by a much more violent tremor. Not just a tremor, but a full ice quake that almost shook the entire cavern. A deafening crack echoed through the space as a massive fissure opened in the cavern floor less than 50 meters from their position. Chunks of ice the size of transport vehicles broke free from the ceiling, crashing down with devastating force. "Emergency protocols activated," announced General Verax through the suddenly staticky comm system. "All trainees prepare for immediate extraction. Seismic activity exceeding safety parameters." Jonas and his shelter mates scrambled to gather their essential equipment. As they emerged from the ice dome, they were confronted with a scene of chaos. The cavern was literally coming apart around them. The makeshift habitat that the third team had constructed had been crushed by a falling ice column, and terrified screams could be heard from within the debris. "We have to help them," Jonas shouted, already running toward the collapsed structure. Rex hesitated only a moment before following his powerful Venerian muscles providing additional speed. They reached the wreckage to find 2 trainees trapped beneath a section of nanomaterial that had been pinned by ice. One was unconscious, the other barely awake and clearly suffering from a serious injury to her lower extremities. "Lift on 3, Jonas instructed Rex, positioning himself at one end of the ice chunk. Together, they managed to create enough space for Toval to pull the injured trainees free. "Sarek and Naline," gasped the conscious trainee. Their habitat collapsed completely. "East quadrant." Jonas looked in the indicated direction and saw that the situation was even worse there. The habitat had not just collapsed, but had been swallowed by a widening fissure in the ice floor. There was no sign of either trainee. "I can hear them," Rex said suddenly, his head tilted to one side. Venerians had auditory capabilities far beyond human range. They're alive, but deep in the crevice. The next minutes were a blur of desperate activity. Jonas repurposed the synthetic cord from his pack, creating a harness that would allow him to be lowered into the fissure. Rex, despite his obvious reluctance to trust a primitive life support system, agreed to serve as anchor, using his species' natural strength and the tools to maintain a secure position. "This is madness," Rex hissed as Jonas prepared to descend. "We should wait for the extraction team." "They'll be dead by then," Jonas replied, checking the knots one final time. "The temperature in that crevice is dropping every second, and their suits are already critically depleted." Without waiting for further argument, Jonas began his descent into the jagged ice chasm. The walls of the fissure were not smooth, but rather a chaos of sharp edges and unexpected protrusions, each threatening to slice through his cord or puncture his thermal suit. The light diminished rapidly, forcing him to activate his helmet lamp, which cast eerie blue shadows across the ice surfaces. 20 meters down, Jonas found them. Sarek was unconscious, a nasty cavity visible on his forehead, where his silver crest met pale skin. Nayland was conscious, but clearly in shock, his normally bright yellow eyes dulled to a sickly amber. Both were wedged onto a small ice shelf that looked dangerously unstable. "I'm going to secure you one at a time," Jonas called to Nalin, who nodded weakly. "Sarek first, since he's unconscious." Transferring an unresponsive body from the precarious ledge to Jonas's harness system was perhaps the most challenging task Jonas had ever undertaken. One wrong move would send them both plummeting deeper into the widening crevice. Using techniques he had learned during mountain rescue training in the Alps, Jonas eventually managed to secure Sarek to his back, the Aurelian's slight frame, making the task marginally easier than it might have been. "Pull us up," Jonas shouted to Rex, and immediately felt the tension in the cord as the Venerian began the extraction process. The ascent was agonizingly slow. Twice, they became wedged against ice protrusions, requiring Jonas to push off with his legs while trying not to destabilize the unconscious Sarek. By the time they reached the surface, Jonas's muscles were screaming with fatigue, and his suit was registering dangerously low temperatures in his extremities. "We need to go back for Nayland," Jonas gasped as Rex helped lift Sarek onto stable ground. "Your core temperature is approaching critical." Rex objected, his scales showing genuine concern in their deep orange hue. "You can't make another descent." "Then you go," Jonas countered, already working to adjust the harness for Rex's larger frame. "I'll anchor." For a moment, it seemed Rex would refuse. Then, with a gesture that might have been respect, he took the harness and began to put it on. "Your primitive rope system had better hold human." "It's held for thousands of years on Earth," Jonas replied with a grim smile, though usually not with Venerian weight. The second rescue was faster, but no less dangerous. The crevice had widened further, and portions of the wall were now actively crumbling. Rex's descent kicked loose a cascade of ice chunks that narrowly missed Nayland on his increasingly unstable perch. But the Venerian's natural strength and agility served him well, and within minutes both he and Nayland were being hauled back to the surface. No sooner had they completed the extraction than another massive tremor shook the cavern. This one was catastrophic. A huge section of the ceiling gave way, collapsing into the main chamber with a thunderous roar. The impact created a shockwave of displaced air that knocked them all off their feet. "All teams report," General Varax's voice was barely audible through the static. A quick assessment revealed that they now had 3 unconscious trainees with various injuries, plus 2 more who were mobile, but showing signs of hypothermia. Only Jonas Rex and 1 other trainee named Lyra were fully functional, and even they were approaching their physical limits after hours of exposure and exertion. Extraction team delayed by seismic activity. Varaxi informed them after receiving their status report. Estimated arrival, 14 hours. You must secure a stable position and conserve energy until then. 14 hours. Jonas looked around at their increasingly dangerous surroundings. The beautiful ice cavern was now a death trap, with continued cracking sounds, indicating that more collapses were imminent. Their damaged habitats were either completely destroyed or too compromised to provide protection. Their only hope was Jonas's ice shelter, which had remarkably survived the quakes with only minor damage. We need to get everyone to the shelter, Jonas decided. It's in the most stable part of the cavern, and we can pool our remaining resources there. Rex, who hours earlier had dismissed the ice structure as primitive and useless, now nodded in agreement. It's our best option. The dome design has proven surprisingly resilient to the shockwaves. Working together, they carefully transported the injured trainees to the shelter. Jonas expanded the entrance temporarily to allow easier access, then resealed it once everyone was inside. The interior was cramped with 8 people, but the close quarters actually worked in their favor, helping to raise the ambient temperature through combined body heat. Jonas surveyed their resources. They had 3 partially functioning thermal units, medical supplies for basic treatment, emergency rations for 48 hours, and communication devices that were working intermittently at best. Most critically, their suit power was approaching dangerous lows across the board. We need to create a power conservation rotation, Jonas explained. 3 people at a time can deactivate their suit heating and rely on the ambient temperature of the shelter plus shared body heat. The others maintain minimal power to their suits. We rotate every hour. Will that be enough? Asked Lyra, the Tellurian trainee, whose crystalline skin had actually proven helpful in the cold conditions due to its natural insulating properties. It has to be, Jonas replied. If we're careful, we can stretch our remaining power to last the 14 hours until extraction. The plan was put into action. Immediately, those with medical training attended to the injured, while others reinforced the ice shelter, adding additional blocks to areas that had shown stress fractures during the quakes. Jonas created a small alcove specifically for their communication beacon, positioning it to maximize its signal strength through the ice. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The temperature inside the shelter fluctuated between -5 and -10 degrees Celsius, cold enough to be extremely uncomfortable, but warm enough to prevent tissue damage if they kept moving regularly and shared their limited heat sources. Outside, they could hear the ongoing destruction of the cavern as more ice columns collapsed and fissures continued to widen. Why did you risk your life for us? Sarek asked Jonas during hour 58, having regained consciousness, though still weak from his injuries. Your shelter was intact. You could have waited safely for extraction. Jonas thought about the question as he carefully monitored the ventilation hole, occasionally clearing it of accumulated ice crystals. Because that's what humans do, he said finally. We look out for each other. It's how we survived before we had all this technology, and it's how we'll survive if technology fails us again. A very Earth-centric perspective, Rex commented, though without hostility. On Venari, the philosophy is individual strength for collective advancement. Different evolutionary paths, similar outcomes, Jonas suggested. Your people developed natural adaptations, strength scales, enhanced senses. Humans developed social cooperation and tool use. Both strategies worked. Yet here we are relying on your primitive ice house rather than our advanced habitats, Rex observed with what might have been a touch of humor. His scales had shifted to a thoughtful purple-blue. Advanced isn't always better, Jonas said. It's just different. The ice here has properties that interfere with our quantum technology, but it's still just ice, and the basic physics of insulation and shelter construction haven't changed in the thousands of years. Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by the communication beacon suddenly chirping to life with unprecedented clarity. Attention trainees, extraction team approaching your position. Prepare for immediate evacuation. Relief swept through the cramped shelter. They had survived. Against all odds with failing technology, and in an environment officially deemed uninhabitable by the Galactic Council itself, they had endured for the full 72 hours of the exercise and beyond. The extraction itself was anticlimactic after their ordeal. A specialized team in heavy-duty environmental suits cut through the cavern ceiling from above, creating a direct access shaft. One by one, the trainees were lifted to the surface and transported to the waiting medical shuttle. Jonas insisted on being the last to leave, helping each of his teammates up the extraction harness, before finally allowing himself to be pulled to safety. On the medical shuttle, as automated systems treated their various injuries and thermal exposure symptoms, General Verax made a rare personal appearance. The Crassian officer moved through the treatment bay, speaking briefly with each trainee, before stopping at Jonas's station. "Trainee Hailsome," Verax said, his multi-layered voice somehow conveying genuine respect despite its natural harshness. "Your performance exceeded all expectations." "Thank you, sir," Jonas replied, too exhausted for anything more elaborate. "The Galactic Council will be receiving my full report on this exercise," Verax continued, "including a recommendation to revise the classification of Zoro 7 from uninhabitable to accessible with specialized equipment and training." Jonas managed a tired smile. "Sir, with all due respect, the most specialized equipment we used was a block of ice." "Precisely." Verax's exoskeleton clicked as he shifted position. "You have demonstrated a valuable principle that the Alliance sometimes forgets. The universe doesn't always bend to our technology. Sometimes we must adapt our approaches instead." As the shuttle broke atmosphere and the curved horizon of Zoro 7 became visible through the viewport, Jonas reflected on the experience. The beautiful, deadly ice world fell away beneath them, its surface glittering like a jewel in the light of its parent planet. It wasn't uninhabitable after all, it just required understanding, respect, and the wisdom to know when ancient solutions might outperform modern ones. "The Alliance has extended an offer," Verax announced before departing. "Upon completion of your training, you are invited to develop a specialized survival curriculum incorporating both advanced technology and traditional methodologies." "I would be honored, sir," Jonas replied. From his medical station across the bay, Rex caught Jonas's eye and touched his forehead in the Venerian gesture of respect. His scales had shifted to a deep blue with gold flecks, the color of profound admiration in his species' emotional spectrum. Jonas returned the gesture, then turned back to the viewport for one last look at Zoro 7. The uninhabitable world had nearly killed them all, yet it had also brought them together and taught them a lesson more valuable than any standard training exercise could have. True survival depended not on technology alone, but on the intelligence to adapt, the courage to act, and the wisdom to recognize which tools, new or ancient, best served the moment's needs. As the medical shuttle accelerated toward the rendezvous point with their transport vessel, Jonas closed his eyes and finally allowed himself to rest. In his mind, he was already designing improvements to the ice shelter, calculating how traditional construction techniques could be enhanced with selective application of modern materials. Not a replacement of one approach with another, but a synthesis, the best of both worlds. And perhaps that synthesis was the most important lesson of all.